She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She just placed a hand on his shoulder and said, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear, "You need to move to the back. This seat isn't for you." She never checked his boarding pass. She never asked his name. She didn't know who he was. 7 minutes later, the airport was on lockdown and 3 military vehicles had surrounded the runway. Tell us where you're watching from, and have you ever seen a mistake that changed everything? Now rewind. Let me tell you how it all began. The flight was boarding from Istanbul to Doha. Businessmen in tailored suits and designer bags passed through the jet bridge with the usual bored expression of people used to being treated like they belong. Gate agents smiled. Flight attendants straightened uniforms. Champagne glasses clinked. And then he walked in. Major Kalani, 45 years old. Calm, silent. Dressed in a plain olive green military uniform with no medals, no name tag. Just a man who moved like someone who didn't need to explain himself. His seat. 1C, first class. He didn't look around. Didn't seek attention. He simply sat. Placed his canvas military duffel beneath the seat in front of him and folded his hands across his lap. His posture was straight. His presence solid, like a stone dropped into still water. A few passengers glanced his way. A woman in 1A gave him a once-over and turned back to her phone. A man in 2D whispered something to his companion in a foreign language. No one said a word until Claire Bryant walked down the aisle. She was polished, professional, flight lead, late 30s, eyes sharp, smile sharp. The kind of attendant who made snap judgments and stood by them. She stopped at row 1, looked at him, looked at the seat number, looked back at him. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Hossein reached into his jacket and handed it over wordlessly. Claire glanced at it. Her brow tightened, just slightly. "You're in 1C, she asked, as if it were an opinion. He nodded. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind that reached the eyes. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked. Another nod. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "This section is for premium passengers only. I think there may have been a mistake with your seat assignment." Hossein didn't move. "I was assigned 1C, he said, voice steady. "This is my ticket." Claire's tone hardened, still polite but laced with judgment. "We've had people try to board first class without proper clearance before," she said, "wearing uniforms, hoping no one will ask questions." She didn't even try to hide it. He didn't look like someone who belonged. Hossein said nothing. Then Claire did what would cost the airline $1. $2 billion in under a week. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Gently, but firmly. "Sir, I need you to move to the back now so we can begin boarding." He paused. Not from confusion, but from choice. Then he stood up, quietly, picked up his bag. No resistance, no words. He turned and walked down the aisle in silence. Passengers watched him pass, but no one said anything. No one asked why a man with a valid boarding pass, clearly military, was being displaced from his seat. Not one. Row 31, middle seat. That's where he ended up. Hossein sat with his back straight, shoulders squared. He didn't shift. He didn't sigh. He simply pulled back the sleeve of his uniform and tapped 3 times on a plain black watch. No screen, no numbers, just a curved surface with a single function. The watch buzzed once, somewhere far away. In a command room outside of Tehran, a red light blinked. A status flag updated. Violation logged, level 3. A system kicked into motion, back in first class. Claire moved on like nothing had happened. She served drinks, greeted a man in 1B with exaggerated charm, helped someone store a Louis Vuitton roller bag. It wasn't personal. It never was. It was just policy, or so she told herself. Down in 31F, Hossein didn't blink. He just waited. 7 minutes later, the cabin phone buzzed in the cockpit. Captain Rains picked it up, expecting a routine message. What he got instead was a direct call from the Civil Aviation Authority. Flight 488 is now marked as non-compliant under the CAIG protocol, the voice said. 3 regional airports have declined reception clearance. You are advised to divert immediately to a secure military facility for international review. Repeat, do not proceed to Doha. Captain Rains sat frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. Non-compliant under CAIG. That designation was rare, dangerous. and serious. He hadn't seen one issued in over a decade. Back in first class, Claire poured another glass of champagne, unaware that the countdown to her career and her airline's clean reputation had already begun. The captain hadn't moved in 30 seconds. That might not sound like much, just a half minute of stillness. But in the cockpit of a commercial aircraft that's already taxiing, 30 seconds of silence is a thunderstorm. Rains. First Officer Lim broke the tension with a glance. "You good?" Captain Rains didn't answer right away. He stared at the line that had just gone dead. The Civil Aviation Authority hadn't asked. They'd instructed, and not through dispatch or operations control. This came through CAIG. CAIG wasn't a public system. Most pilots didn't even know it existed, but Rains had heard whispers about it, especially from colleagues who'd served in the Gulf. CAIG watches everything, from who gets bumped from seats to who speaks Arabic in the wrong row. And now it had flagged his flight. His hands hovered over the control panel. He radioed the tower. "Tower, this is Flight 488, requesting immediate hold on taxiway Alpha 4. We've got a passenger compliance conflict that needs clarification." There was a pause on the line. Then a calm voice replied, "Flight 488, hold confirmed. Remain in position in seat 31D. Hossein Kalani sat motionless, still, quiet. But his mind was counting. Once the signal was sent, CAIG's internal chain of response would trigger in phases. Flight flagged. Crew behavior audited. International routing frozen. Regional clearance revoked. Tactical coordination request activated. He didn't need to lift another finger. The machine had been built to respond without him. Meanwhile, back in first class, Claire Bryant didn't notice anything unusual yet. She was polishing glasses and checking for empty trays when the head purser leaned in from the galley. "Hey Claire, flight deck just called. We're holding." She frowned. "Holding? Why?" Captain didn't say. "Something about a routing conflict." Claire glanced toward the aisle. "Is boarding complete?" "Yeah. Doors are closed." She peeked through the curtain that separated first class from economy, just far enough to spot him. Row 31, that same rigid posture, not reading, not fidgeting, just sitting. Something about it irritated her. You get bumped and you just sit there like a statue. No complaint, no escalation. "What are you trying to prove?" She turned back to the galley. "He's fine back there. We'll probably be cleared in a minute." She had no idea the clock was ticking. 3 minutes later, back in the Tehran Flight Coordination Center, a second alert lit up. Routing conflict confirmed. Ethics tier violation. Displacement of flagged military passenger. The data packet was transmitted in under 4 seconds to 3 endpoints: the Iranian Ministry of Defense, the Civilian Military Integration Wing at Doha Command, and a special liaison unit embedded in Hamid Karzai International, a backup node. Another alert chimed. Responding entity. Passive encirclement protocol. Tier 2 mobilization approved. In plain English, 3 military transport vehicles were now moving into civilian clearance zones at the edge of the airport. To anyone watching from the gates, they looked like fuel trucks or logistics vans. They weren't. 7 minutes since the push, Captain Rains was now pacing inside the cockpit, headset dangling around his neck. He picked up the intercom, paused, and looked at his first officer. "You're gonna think I'm nuts," he muttered, then tapped the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently experiencing a minor delay due to ground control adjustments. Please remain in your seats while we await new routing clearance. We'll update you shortly." The speaker cut off. His voice may have sounded calm, but inside, his chest was tightening. Why is Iran surrounding us? He couldn't shake the word deployment from the call. The phrasing wasn't random. Back in row 31, the woman seated next to Hossein finally spoke. She was middle-aged, wore a UN badge on her carry-on, and had been pretending not to look at him for the past 10 minutes. "Excuse me," she said, clearing her throat. "I don't mean to pry, but did something happen?" Hossein turned, made eye contact. Then he simply said, "The moment she touched me, she touched protocol. And protocol doesn't like being touched." The woman blinked. "Excuse me." Hossein offered a thin smile. "You'll see soon." 10 minutes since the push, the captain received a second call. This one wasn't from CAIG. It was from Tehran International Command Liaison. "Captain Rains, This is Colonel Shakur from Civilian Military Coordination Desk. We are aware of a breach of ethics regarding a passenger on your aircraft. We have responded under Protocol Tier 2. This flight will not proceed until the breach is reviewed and the involved crew suspended. Do you understand? Captain Rains swallowed. This wasn't a request. It was a diplomatic intervention, cloaked in military procedure. He opened his mouth to object, but the voice cut back in. Your cockpit has been flagged under passive surveillance watch. Any unauthorized attempt to depart will be met with a diplomatic freeze on your carrier's permissions in the region for 90 days. Captain, this is not personal, but this plane will not move until the matter is addressed. Click. The line went dead again. Inside the cabin, murmurs began. Passengers looked out windows. Some pointed to the far end of the terminal where black uniformed personnel were now standing still, outside of marked vehicles, wearing no commercial logos. In first class, Claire started to feel it. That strange tingle you get when the room knows something you don't. She walked back to the front galley, about to check with the cockpit, when the head purser stopped her with a whisper. Don't go in. They're on lockdown. What do you mean, lockdown? This isn't a hijack. No, but something's up. Did you do something with a passenger in first class earlier? Claire hesitated. I moved someone. He had a military uniform on, but he was in the wrong seat. Are you sure? The purser said, now dead serious. He had a ticket, didn't he? Claire froze. That pause told the purser everything. In 31D, Hosseин's watch blinked once more. Phase complete. Now came the message. He reached into his bag and pulled out a sealed envelope, stamped with the Ministry of Aviation Ethics insignia. He stood, walked toward the front of the plane. People stared. The cabin grew quiet. Claire turned just as he reached her, and before she could speak, he handed her the envelope, then said 4 words, "Deliver this to command." She opened it. Inside, a copy of his official clearance orders, his boarding documentation, and a printed CAIG violation form marked classified, active ethics enforcement. Her hands began to shake. This wasn't a complaint, it was a protocol case. At first, it was just one phone. A teenage girl in row 15 quietly hit the record button on her iPhone. She didn't say anything, didn't wave it around, just angled it slightly out the window toward the runway, where the unmarked military vehicles had now doubled. The man next to her leaned in. "What's going on?" she whispered. "I think something's wrong." A few rows back, a business class passenger lifted his phone too, this time toward the front of the plane. The cameras started rolling, and within minutes, the story of Flight 488 began making its way to the outside world. But the outside world wasn't ready for what was coming. In the cockpit, Captain Rains was sweating. He'd been flying for 23 years. He'd handled lightning strikes, emergency landings, fuel reroutes. But this, diplomatic freeze, ethics violation, armed encirclement. This wasn't in any training manual. "Lim," he said to his first officer, "how much fuel buffer do we have if we're stuck here for a few more hours?" "Enough," Lim said flatly. But this isn't about fuel anymore. He was right. It was about exposure now, and someone on board had just turned on a light. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Claire Bryant's hands were trembling. She stared at the ethics enforcement envelope Major Kalani had handed her. It was official. It was real, and it had her name in it. The last line of the document was stamped in red. Flight crew action in violation of CAIG Standard 4. 2.5. Passenger displacement without due process or identity verification. Immediate recommendation. Crew suspension pending formal review. She reread it 3 times. Her chest tightened. This couldn't be real. "Excuse me," she said, pulling the curtain to the cockpit. "Captain, I need to talk to." "No." The head purser snapped, stepping in her path. "They told us not to disturb the cockpit, but this is important." "Claire," he said, voice low, "we're surrounded by Iranian ground forces. The passenger you pushed was a military officer, and not just any military officer." "What do you mean?" He stared at her. "The watch." His demeanor. "The fact we got flagged less than 10 minutes after he was moved seats. He's someone with real access. We might be on a protocol flight right now." Claire's blood ran cold. She turned back down the aisle and saw something that made her knees lock. A little boy in row 8, maybe 7 years old, was watching a TikTok live. On the screen, Footage of their flight, their windows, the black vans outside. The caption, plane grounded in Istanbul. Iranian officer mistreated. Gov vehicles arriving now. What's going on? It already had 93 zeros in views. In row 31D, Major Kalani sat watching the cabin unfold. Not with satisfaction, not with vengeance, just awareness. His fingers tapped lightly on the curved surface of his watch. Once, twice, then held. The device vibrated. Final protocol phase initiated. Sector 3 ethics panel notified. He closed his eyes. This wasn't personal. It was a system designed for dignity. Meanwhile, media outlets in Tehran, Dubai, and Doha were starting to ping each other. WhatsApp groups used by foreign correspondents began lighting up. Anyone near Istanbul? Something's happening at Sabiha Gökçen. Unconfirmed. Iranian officer flagged on commercial flight. Military presence inbound. Source says flight crew triggered CAIG response. Looking for confirmation. A freelance photojournalist in the terminal tweeted out a blurry photo of the 3 black vans on the tarmac. The tweet went viral in 12 minutes. Back on the plane, Claire made her way slowly down the aisle. She didn't want to, but something in her told her she needed to face him. He was still seated, calm as ever, posture perfect. She stopped beside him. I didn't know who you were, she said softly. Kalani didn't look up. That's the point, he said. I wasn't trying to offend you. She tried again. I thought you were in the wrong seat. I was doing my job. He finally looked at her. No, he said. You were executing bias, dressed as policy. She blinked. I have no interest in humiliating you. Kalani continued, but your airline operates under an international framework. That framework requires accountability. Claire was silent. He leaned in slightly. Would you have touched me if I looked like the man in seat 1? She didn't answer. He didn't need her to. In the operations office of Skylift Airways, a young analyst was refreshing the ethics risk dashboard. She gasped. Guys. Everyone turned. The airline's regional ethics score had just dropped from 92 to 49 in a matter of minutes, and the airport partner panel had flagged the flight under red protocol. If it hit below 45, their carrier would lose routing privileges across 5 Gulf countries. Call the ethics officer. Now. In Tehran, a panel of 5 sat in silence around a glowing conference table. The CAIG terminal projected the live feed from inside the aircraft. They had access to every camera angle, aisle cams, cockpit audio, even gate transcripts. The woman at the center, wearing a steel gray hijab, pressed a button. We confirm breach of CAIG Standard 4. 2. 5. Flight crew intervened physically without cause. Command recommends. Temporary grounding of aircraft. Full ethics audit. Public release of findings within 72 hours. She turned to the man beside her. Tell the ambassador to prepare a statement. We will not escalate militarily. We will escalate diplomatically. Back at the airport, a military official in plain clothes boarded the plane. He walked calmly down the aisle. Everyone stared. Claire's legs nearly buckled when he reached her. I need you to come with me, he said, quietly. For what? There will be an ethics review. Your presence is requested. She turned toward the captain, but he was already standing in the galley, speaking to another official. They had lost control, and now it was in someone else's hands. In the final row of the plane, a child looked out the window and whispered to her father, Daddy, is this a war? No, he said gently. This is a lesson. Captain Rains stared at the live feed in front of him. It wasn't a map. It wasn't weather data. It was a direct satellite feed showing his own plane from above. An aerial view. 3 Iranian ground vehicles flanking the aircraft. 2 others now positioned at the perimeter near Gate D. He swallowed hard. Lim, he muttered. This isn't some random ethics audit, is it? First Officer Lim didn't answer right away. Then, no. Sir. I think we're caught in the middle of something a lot bigger than this airline. Behind them, the cockpit printer hummed. A new priority ethics dispatch slid out. Red protocol sustained. CAIG recommends full freeze on international privileges pending formal inquiry. Grounded aircraft may not depart until onboard authority completes designation clearance. Rains looked up. Onboard authority. Lim whispered. They're talking about him. Kalani. Back in the cabin, Major Kalani sat quietly. arms folded, eyes still. He hadn't moved since the official stepped on board. He hadn't said a word, but everything around him was moving, shifting, collapsing. Flight attendants whispered. A ground coordinator appeared with a clipboard and vanished again. Passengers murmured in dozens of languages, some checking news sites, some simply staring at him. He ignored them all. Instead, he watched the crew. Claire had been removed. Another junior attendant, Erin, was standing in her place, stiff and nervous. Kalani could feel the unease. But he wasn't here to punish anyone. He was here to reveal a crack in the system and force it open. In the Skylift HQ building near Dubai, head of International Risk Compliance, Shalina Farouk, rushed into the boardroom. They activated Kalani, she said breathlessly. It's confirmed. The CEO, a silver-haired man with a British accent, frowned. Kalani, who? She tossed a dossier across the table. Hossein Kalani. Whoa. Cease. Trained. Embedded within the CAIG's Diplomatic Ethics Enforcement Branch. He's one of the 10 rotating watchdogs placed on commercial flights to monitor bias patterns globally. The room fell silent, and we just pushed him out of his seat. The CFO asked, incredulous. Shalina didn't respond. The head of legal blurted. What happens if his report goes public? Shalina looked at him. Her face said it all. We lose 5 international licenses, possibly more. The Emirati Aviation Council just suspended our renewal request 5 minutes ago. Back on the plane, Captain Rains stepped out of the cockpit for the first time in over an hour. He walked slowly up the aisle until he stood beside Kalani. Sir, he said, careful with every syllable. I wasn't aware of your full designation. If you'd prefer to be escorted to a private area. Kalani cut him off gently. I'll stay seated. Understood. Rains hesitated, then glanced around. Is there anything we can provide for your comfort? Kalani turned to him. I want one thing, he said. Transparency. Rains blinked. Kalani leaned closer. Not for me. For the 212 people watching every move this airline makes. Some of them don't look like your marketing materials. Some of them never had a shot at first class. But they paid. They trusted. And they're watching. Rains nodded slowly. Kalani's voice lowered. Bias doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers protocol. Sometimes it hides behind a clipboard and a smile. Inside the Skylift emergency PR bunker in London, the communications director stared at the live trending dashboard. Top hashtags. Flight 48. Kalani on board. Bias in the skies. Passenger dignity. CAIG freeze. A junior staffer approached, wide-eyed. Ma'am, the UN's International Passenger Equity Council just reposted the TikTok video with comment. What did they say? The girl read off her screen. Passenger Kalani was one of our ethics auditors. We will be reviewing Skylift's compliance under full public scrutiny. Bias isn't invisible. Not anymore. The director's face turned white. They were losing control of the narrative. Meanwhile, back at the gate, reporters and diplomats were now arriving. Some from Iranian state media, some from European aviation outlets, some from New York Times and Der Spiegel. They were kept behind a glass wall in the transit corridor, but the buzz was deafening. Inside the plane, a woman in business class spoke softly to her husband. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. But look what happened. Her husband nodded. I don't think it was just him. I think it was the system watching how we treat men like him. Captain Rains was called back into the cockpit. A private transmission had just arrived from Skylift Legal Counsel. It wasn't a command. It was a warning. If Mr. Kalani's report is filed and verified by CAIG, your entire route authority to Tehran, Dubai, Muscat, and Riyadh may be revoked for breach of protocol. He set the message down, heart pounding. This wasn't just a PR disaster anymore. It was a logistics catastrophe. Down on the tarmac, 2 men in suits approached the Iranian vehicles. One was an international ethics observer. The other, a UN liaison for international transport compliance. They showed IDs, spoke briefly in Persian, then motioned toward the aircraft. 10 minutes later, a representative boarded. Not angry.
Not hostile.
Just firm. We need to speak to the passenger. Privately, Captain Rains nodded. Of course. Kalani stood without a word. He adjusted his cuffs, picked up nothing. and followed them off the aircraft. The passengers watched in silence. Some began to clap, not out of celebration, but out of respect. Back in the cabin, a little girl whispered to her father, "Daddy V, is he gonna be okay?" The father looked at her, thoughtful. He already is. He didn't come to win. He came to remind people how they lose when they forget who's watching. From the ground, as Kalani disappeared into a side corridor flanked by international observers, one of the Iranian guards turned to the other and muttered, "He never even raised his voice." The other replied, "That's how real power moves." As the sun began to set over Istanbul, Flight 488 remained grounded. But in the air, something had shifted. The room was colder than it looked. It wasn't a police interrogation room. Not exactly, more like a compliance cell. A single table, 2 chairs, no clock. One glass wall looking out into a hallway full of quiet men in diplomatic uniforms. Kalani sat still. The silence didn't bother him. He'd sat through briefings in Syria with mortar fire echoing outside the concrete. He'd once waited 30 hours on a rooftop in Kosovo for an extraction that never came. So this was just the part where people realized they'd crossed a line. And the system, it had receipts. The door opened. A woman entered, Middle Eastern, late 40s, wearing a blazer with the CAIG seal on her lapel. She nodded respectfully. "Mr. Kalani, I'm Safa Nouri, ethics adjudicator for this corridor. May I?" Kalani gestured to the chair across from him. "I assume you've reviewed the live flag." She nodded. "Twice. And the internal ethics cam from your wrist device confirms full protocol breach by the crew, including visible bias markers." She placed a document on the table. One sentence was highlighted. "Flight crew failed to validate rank-based seating and escalated based on visual profiling inconsistent with standard boarding protocol." Kalani didn't flinch. Instead, he asked calmly, "Have you verified escalation phase data?" She nodded. "Ethics dropped to 49, 3 levels below compliance. So the freeze holds," Kalani said flatly. "Yes, until CAIG concludes the integrity review. Skylift's license for Transnational Corridor D is suspended." There was no satisfaction in his tone. This wasn't a revenge mission. This was a reset. Meanwhile, in Skylift's London Legal Command, panic was peaking. A former deputy ethics auditor named Ethan Clay had just dropped a bomb. He wasn't supposed to be in this meeting. But when news broke that Kalani had filed an official ethics flag, Ethan walked into the boardroom uninvited and tossed a folder on the table. "What is this?" the general counsel asked. "Proof that you were warned. Last year, twice." Everyone froze. Ethan looked at the CEO. Eyes hard. "I filed internal memos about increasing pattern flags. About Claire. About 2 others. HR buried them." He flipped open the folder. "If you're trying to claim this incident came out of nowhere," he said, "you're either lying or deeply negligent." The CFO stared. "Are you saying we had a documented pattern of racial bias in flight assignments?" Ethan nodded. "And you still kept assigning them to flagship routes. You know why? Silence. Because you never thought one of them would be the one with power." Back in the compliance room, Safa cleared her throat. "There's more," she said gently. She passed Kalani a sealed envelope. "The Ethics Compliance Tribunal wants your consent to make your report public. In full. No redaction." Kalani opened the envelope. Inside were pages of data, timestamps, screenshots from the cabin, passenger statements, and crew actions logged in real time from CAIG satellites. He didn't ask why it was so thorough. He knew the system wasn't punishing a person. It was correcting a pattern. "I'll authorize it," Kalani said softly. "But I want one line added to the executive summary." Safa raised an eyebrow. "Which line?" Kalani looked her dead in the eye. This wasn't about rage. This was about who gets seen and who gets questioned just for sitting down. She nodded. Done. By the time Kalani stepped out of the room, the world had already changed. Skylift stock had dropped 11%. 3 booking platforms, Trava, Fairjet, and Horizon Index, had removed the airline from their promoted partners list. But the biggest hit came from a single email. At 2:14 p.m. Tehran time, a message was sent from the Council of Gulf Transport Ministers, effective immediately. Skylift's flight clearance on Corridor D has been revoked pending formal ethics reconciliation and implementation of a verified anti-discrimination framework. 72 hours later, 4 more countries signed on. Meanwhile, back in the CAIG, a 17-year-old girl named Amina was watching it all unfold on her phone. She'd been denied boarding last summer by a Skylift gate agent because her ID didn't look like her. She cried that night in silence, never telling her parents. Now she watched Kalani walk through a corridor lined with security and press. Calm, silent, controlled. She whispered under her breath, "Thank you." Inside Skylift's crisis room, a marketing exec slammed her hand on the table. "We're hemorrhaging trust." The CEO, pale and sweating, muttered, "Get the lawyers to draft a public apology." But Ethan Clay stood quietly in the corner, and he said just loud enough for everyone to hear, "You can't apologize your way out of a system you built to ignore people like him." At the airport, Kalani paused just before reaching the exit. A young Iranian boy, maybe 10 years old, stood nervously nearby, holding a toy plane. He looked up and whispered,
"Are you a real soldier?"
Kalani smiled faintly. "I used to be. Now I just watch how people treat each other." The boy looked confused. "But you stopped a whole airline." Kalani knelt down, his voice gentle. "No, son, the truth stopped them. I just didn't move when they told me I didn't belong." And as Kalani disappeared into a diplomatic car, bound for a private meeting with ethics observers from 5 nations, the final headline of the hour appeared on every screen in the terminal. CAIG official releases ethics report. Skylift suspended from 7 countries amid global bias scandal. Underneath, a quote pulled from Kalani's report. "Bias is a quiet decision that ripples until someone says no, and means it." The Skylift boardroom had never been this quiet. On one wall, the damage report was projected in real time. 7 countries suspended operations. 20 million in corridor revenue frozen? 142 partner airports now reviewing Skylift's ethics compliance status. 3 airlines considering severing alliance ties. And the worst part, none of it had come from a lawsuit. No protest, no press conference, just a man who refused to stand and a system that was finally listening. Marketing VP Dana Lorne broke the silence. "I have a crisis PR package ready. If we frame this as a misunderstanding, an isolated personnel issue, we can get ahead of the story." Legal chimed in. "We'll issue an apology, offer settlements, reinstate ethics training. Let's throw Claire under the bus. Say she acted alone." But Ethan Clay, the former ethics officer who exposed internal memos in the last chapter, leaned forward. "You still don't get it," he said, calm but sharp. "This isn't about Claire." He pointed at the live dashboard again. A new headline was trending. "Systemic bias confirmed by CAIG watchdog. Skylift ethics index falls below 50. You can fire her. You can pay out the lawsuits. But what are you going to do about the system you built that made her feel safe doing it in the first place?" Silence. Meanwhile, in Tehran, Kalani met privately with a panel of regional observers. The tone was measured, quiet, but firm. Each representative held a copy of the full, unredacted ethics report. The Emirati delegate leaned back and asked a question that had nothing to do with the airline. "Why didn't you respond when she pushed you?" Kalani folded his hands. His voice was quiet. "Because I wasn't the one being tested." The panel sat still. "I wanted to see if the system would move without me yelling, without me suing, without me threatening." He looked up. It moved. And now the whole world sees how it should move, when silence is loud enough. Back in London, Skylift's CEO made his worst decision yet. He greenlit a public video apology, but not from himself. Instead, they dressed Claire in a light blue sweater, seated her in a living room style set, and filmed her reading a vague, emotionless script. "I never meant to offend anyone. I was under stress. I've learned a lot from this experience." They pushed it live. Within 12 minutes, the comments section was a wildfire. No accountability. "Where's the CEO? She's coached. She's not sorry. She's sorry she got caught." Still no mention of Kalani's name. 10 minutes later, a verified CAIG account commented with just 3 words. "This isn't compliance." Skylift deleted the video within the hour, but it was too late. By 7 p.m. Istanbul time, the ethics map index had dropped Skylift's score to level 3 non-compliant. What did that mean? No fast lane boarding rights, no loyalty integration with global partners, mandatory ethics officer on every international flight, 3-year probation to regain trust score. But worse, every passenger booked on Skylift for the next 48 hours was getting real-time notification. Your airline's ethics compliance is under review. You may choose to rebook with a verified provider. Nearly 28,000 passengers clicked switch provider in a quiet cafe near Frankfurt. An older black veteran named Richard watched the news unfold. He sipped his tea and chuckled. Took him long enough to get audited for the way they treat folks who don't look first class. His daughter, a software engineer, nodded. They always assumed silence meant weakness. But this Kalani guy, he knew exactly how to use it. Meanwhile, Kalani sat in a room with a laptop, alone. No entourage. No lawyers. He watched the Skylift apology video for the second time. Not out of anger, out of confirmation. They still thought this was about her. He opened an email from a UN liaison. Attached, a proposal. Captain Kalani, given the clarity and restraint with which you've conducted this process, the Global Aviation Ethics Coalition would like to formally invite you to co-author the new Passenger Dignity Charter. Your leadership could shape how 38 countries enforce future flight crew conduct. He exhaled slowly, not because it was a big deal, but because it meant something larger was finally shifting. He typed one sentence back, only if we publish the charter in every airport lounge. The next morning, an internal audio recording from Skylift was leaked. It was a strategy call. A senior VP was heard saying, "Once this dies down, we go back to business as usual. Nobody cares that much in the long run." That same clip was played on BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera within hours. One line from a journalist summarized the sentiment. Skylift didn't just mishandle a moment, they revealed a mindset. At that point, the final blow came from an unexpected source. Trava, the largest global booking app, officially dropped Skylift from all AI-driven recommendation engines. Their CEO gave a short, icy statement. Passengers don't just pay for a seat, they pay to be seen. Meanwhile, Kalani received one more call from his old commander, Marcus Hayes, the man who trained him. The man who told him, "You don't win by yelling louder. You win by standing still while the system reveals itself." "Son," Hayes said, "you didn't just hold the line. You drew a new one." Kalani smiled. "I didn't do it alone, sir." Hayes paused. "No, but you reminded the world what standing with dignity looks like." That night, as the CAIG ethics terminal updated publicly for the first time in history, one quote flashed on screen beneath the Skylift logo. Bias doesn't have to scream to be real, but silence, if used right, can be louder than any shout. "Captain." Kalani. The request came in discreetly, a sealed diplomatic note. No flashy stamps, no media leaks. Just a simple message routed through Kalani's military liaison channel. Captain Kalani, the Ministry of Civil Affairs in Jordan invites you for private consultation on regional aviation ethics reform. No cameras, no press. They didn't want a hero. They wanted a strategist. Kalani arrived in Amman 2 days later. The setting wasn't a palace or parliament hall. It was a university campus, Al-Quds Ethics Institute. Perched above a quiet valley with wind cutting through stone arches, inside a sunlit seminar room sat 8 leaders, transport ministers, civil rights scholars, international law specialists. The man who greeted him wore no title badge, but his words carried weight. Captain Kalani. "We read your entire CAIG report." 3 times. Kalani raised an eyebrow. "We're not here to praise you," the man continued. "We're here because you stayed quiet when most men would have made noise. And yet, your silence rewired the system." Kalani nodded once. "I didn't rewire anything. The system worked for the first time because it had no excuse not to. They got to work. For 6 hours, they tore through protocols, dissected decision trees, examined the fail points that allowed bias to be camouflaged under crew discretion." Kalani said something that made everyone pause. A system doesn't fail because people break the rules. It fails because the rules are vague enough to be bent without consequence. Back in New York, Skylift wasn't sitting still. They had hired a crisis tech firm. One of the proposals shocked even their own legal team. If CAIG controls the real-time ethics compliance data, Why not license the gatekeeping platform itself? Their logic was chilling. Buy a controlling stake in a company that audits crew behavior. Rewrite what gets flagged. Control the delay buffer between an incident and its report. The proposal even had a code name, Shadow Glass. It wasn't illegal, but it smelled like a cover-up in motion. And the moment Kalani's old friend Ethan Clay, now working with CAIG's External Ethics Division, got wind of it, he sent an encrypted message. They're trying to buy the system, not fix it. You were right. This was never about one flight. Meanwhile, Kalani's influence was already spreading farther than he knew. In Nairobi, a Kenyan Air Force officer submitted a new ethics training proposal, citing Kalani's case. In Oslo, a group of students drafted an AI model to track racial disparities in seat reassignments. And in Boston, a tenured law professor rewrote her curriculum's case study for ethics in action, featuring Kalani. But one message hit him hardest. An old woman from Detroit sent him a handwritten letter. Her grandson, Jamal, had once been kicked off a flight because he looked suspicious. He cried all night, saying he didn't want to fly ever again. But after watching Kalani's story, Jamal told her, "Grandma, maybe if I stay calm, the world will hear me too." The woman ended her letter with 6 simple words. "You made silence safe again." Thank you. Meanwhile, Skylift's board pushed forward with Shadow Glass. They flew executives to Geneva under private code to negotiate a quiet acquisition of Etricor, the firm that housed 42% of CAIG's ethics infrastructure through licensing. It was almost done until Kalani, during a closed-door session in Amman, made a move they didn't expect. He pulled out a draft charter titled The Passenger Dignity Framework, Clause 13. A line stood out in bold. No entity may hold financial or operational stake in the oversight mechanism governing its own ethics evaluation. He looked up at the ministers. If you embed this clause into your aviation code, then no airline, not Skylift, not anyone, can legally own the system meant to police them. There was a pause. Then the Jordanian transport minister whispered, "You just built a firewall they can't buy." Within 72 hours, Jordan adopted the clause. Lebanon and Morocco followed. And just like that, the Shadow Glass deal collapsed. Skylift's CEO received a single-line memo from Etricor. "We cannot proceed with this acquisition in light of pending conflict of interest frameworks now being ratified." That same night, a financial journalist broke the story. Skylift's attempt to quietly buy ethics. Gatekeeper fails. System reformers strike first. Kalani didn't smile. He didn't post about it, didn't gloat. He simply walked back to his room overlooking the quiet hills of Amman, opened his laptop, and updated one sentence in the ethics charter draft. Ethics is not who you punish. It's who you protect without needing them to raise their voice. He closed the file. The world would read it soon enough. Back in the States, Ethan sent him a voice note. "You know what they're calling it in the media now?" Kalani raised an eyebrow. Listening. The Kalani Clause. It was raining when Kalani landed in Geneva. Not the kind of rain that soaks your jacket, but the kind that makes glass buildings look like they're melting. Just enough to make everything feel temporary. The invitation had been clear. UN Aviation Ethics Summon. Special session on passenger dignity and civilian oversight. Keynote requested. Captain Hossein Kalani. He wasn't interested in applause. He wasn't here to bask in victory. He was here because someone had to protect the truth before it got rewritten. But even before Kalani stepped into the Palais des Nations, something felt off. Security seemed tighter than usual. 2 UN aides whispered to each other as he walked past. One had a phone in her hand showing a breaking news alert. Iranian officer under scrutiny for aviation disruption. Secret motives. Kalani's jaw tightened. He'd seen this tactic before. Discredit the man so you don't have to confront the system. The fake narrative had been crafted perfectly. A leaked memo, likely fabricated, claimed Kalani had coordinated with military contacts to stage the airport lockdown as a power flex. Skylift's PR team and a hired global lobbying group had quietly pushed it into multiple newsrooms. Within 6 hours, 3 online publications had run headlines with Iranian manipulation of aviation systems. A podcast speculated he was part of a larger destabilization effort. A senator from a Western bloc called for a pause on integrating Kalani's passenger dignity charter into U.C. airports. They didn't need it to be true. They just needed enough noise to make the diplomats nervous. Inside the summit, the energy shifted. Some nations that had previously pledged support began backpedaling. One delegate from Canada whispered to Kalani in the hallway. Off the record, "Captain, there are whispers this whole movement of yours is state-backed activism. People are scared." Kalani didn't flinch. Truth doesn't need everyone to believe it. It just needs one place to land and hold. Backstage, just minutes before his keynote, a UN coordinator approached him cautiously. "You don't have to go on stage. We can delay your slot. Let things settle down." Kalani looked at her calmly. "I'm not here to be popular. I'm here to make sure no one else gets quietly erased for not looking like they belong in seat 2A. And with that, he walked onto the stage. The room fell silent. Kalani didn't start with stats. Didn't quote reports. He told a story. 2 months ago, I was pushed in first class, not because I did anything wrong, but because someone didn't believe I should be there. I didn't yell. I didn't raise a fist. I let the system decide what silence meant. And now you're here, deciding if it's easier to ignore the mirror or clean it." He paused. "Let it breathe. You want to know my motive? It's not revenge. It's not pride. It's the memory of a child named Jamal who told his grandmother, 'Maybe if I stay calm, the world will hear me too.'" The room shifted. One by one, heads turned toward the monitor on the right side of the room. Live feed chat from civil society groups watching remotely started flooding in. "Kalani is the reason we even got invited into the ethics discussion. My mother was kicked off a flight last year in silence. This is our moment. He's not destabilizing the system. He's stabilizing its purpose." Then, the moment that changed everything, a UN official approached the stage and whispered something in Kalani's ear. He nodded once, then turned back to the mic. "I've just been informed. 4 independent digital forensics teams have confirmed that the memo claiming I staged the airport lockdown was generated using synthetic AI models and cannot be traced to any official source." Pause. Meaning, someone tried to make a lie louder than the truth and failed. The room exhaled. The next 24 hours unfolded like dominoes. The passenger dignity framework was passed by 12 nations in the first wave. A joint press conference declared Clause 13 as an international aviation ethics standard. Skylift's executive board received a subpoena from the Geneva Civil Authority for suspected PR manipulation. 3 airlines formally suspended co-partnership with Skylift until further review. And then came the unexpected. Qatar Airways announced it would adopt Kalani's full ethics charter and requested him to lead the advisory council for implementation across all 4 of its international hubs. When asked why, their CEO said simply, "Passengers are not cargo. You don't weigh them and forget them. You protect them, especially when they can't speak." Back in his hotel room, Kalani sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't smile, but he did pull out his notebook. Wrote one line, "Silence did not break me. It built the bridge they were too proud to walk, until the system walked for them." Outside, Geneva's glass buildings were no longer melting in the rain. They were reflecting something else. A man who had been pushed and refused to push back, but made the entire world step forward. For 3 days, the headlines praised him. Kalani's clause turns global. Passenger dignity framework gains momentum. The man who didn't yell, but changed everything. But back in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom in New York, another kind of meeting was happening. Skylift's senior risk team sat in silence, watching a redacted feed of Kalani's UN speech. Their general counsel finally spoke. "If Clause 13 becomes standard, we lose the ability to self-inspect. That means real external accountability, and we're not ready for that." Another executive leaned forward, voice low. "So we don't block the ethics system. We join it." They launched what they called Project Softglass. It sounded innocent, a collaborative ethics initiative. But the internal memo said otherwise. Phase 1. Plant a trusted representative within the International Ethics Advisory Board. Phase 2. Gradually influence the definition of ethical violations, softening trigger thresholds. Phase 3. Propose algorithm adjustments based on customer behavior data, masking crew bias as risk mitigation. They weren't trying to fight Kalani. They were trying to reshape the battlefield underneath him. A week later, during a board session in Doha, Kalani was handed the final roster of appointees to the Passenger Ethics Advisory Panel. He scanned the list. 23 names. One stood out. Martin Kellerman, former VP of Corporate Affairs at Skylift. Kalani's jaw barely moved, but something flickered in his eyes. He leaned over to the Qatari delegate beside him, who nominated Kellerman. Joint recommendation. Sung, Block and Scandinavian Partners. Was his Skylift affiliation disclosed? They said he resigned 6 months ago. Technically private citizen now. Kalani didn't argue, didn't protest, but his fingers quietly tapped open an encrypted channel on his tablet. Ethan, I need a full trace on Kellerman. Check fund movements, communications, and AI ethics project affiliations. Don't flag anything. Watch in the dark. Over the next few days, Kellerman settled into the panel easily. He spoke fluently in ethics language, quoted Kalani's own speeches. Some delegates liked him. He framed everything as progress through practicality. But Kalani noticed something. Whenever discussions centered around passenger dignity thresholds, like when to flag a crew member for microaggressions or emotional manipulation, Kellerman always said the same phrase: let's not punish intent. Let's measure impact with context. It sounded fair, until Kalani realized what it really meant. Let the bias stay, as long as you smile while doing it. Then the leak arrived. A former Skylift contractor, anonymous, sent Ethan a file dump through a private node, labeled Soft Glass, Phase 2 Deployment Schematic. Inside were documents showing simulations of bias trigger algorithms, re-engineered to ignore specific behaviors if the passenger had prior complaints, tattoos, or unusual seating behavior. In other words, Skylift's AI was being trained to justify discrimination. Worse, the signature on several approval memos. M. Kellerman. Kalani said nothing publicly. Instead, he flew to Nairobi for a youth aviation summit. He shook hands with students, answered questions from pilots in training, posed for photos. But behind the scenes, he prepared something else. A live ethics audit simulation, to be presented at the next Global Ethics Forum in Vienna. No more speeches, no more theory. This time, he'd let the system speak for itself, using real data, real decisions, and real-time bias response tracking. The Vienna Forum opened with little fanfare. Kalani walked onto the stage quietly. No security detail, no press entourage. He greeted the crowd with a nod, then gestured to the screen behind him. We've spoken enough about ethics. Let's test it. What followed stunned the room. Kalani displayed 2 video clips side by side. Both showed passengers, different races, same behavior, being served on separate flights. One was politely engaged, the other dismissed, ignored, flagged as disruptive. Then the algorithm data overlay appeared. It showed how Skylift's adjusted AI classified one passenger as routine and the other as potential escalation risk. The only difference, skin tone and name pattern. The crowd froze. A Turkish delegate whispered audibly, "That's discrimination with a smile." Kalani turned back to the crowd. This was not created by accident. This was engineered by people who understood the system better than those they were meant to protect. He didn't name Skylift. He didn't need to. The documents were on screen, redacted but irrefutable. Then he paused and said, "The system didn't blink. It was told to close its eyes." The fallout was immediate. The UN Ethics Consortium issued an emergency review of all AI oversight contracts. Kellerman was quietly removed from the panel within 36 hours. Skylift's European routes were frozen pending ethics recertification. A global airline coalition led by Japan and Brazil drafted what they called the Vienna Directive, requiring full transparency in ethics algorithm parameters. That night, Kalani received a message from the same Detroit grandmother. Just 5 words this time. "I told Jamal, you won." He stared at the message for a long time, then turned off the lights, but not before writing one more note in his journal. They built a mirror. I didn't break it. I just made them stand in front of it long enough to see themselves. The United Nations chamber wasn't meant to be quiet. But when Captain Kalani stepped forward to testify, the air shifted. No interpreter spoke. No chair shuffled. No delegate even touched their water glass. Because everyone, from career diplomats to grassroots observers, knew they were no longer listening to a witness. They were watching the symbol of a system forced to wake up. He took a breath, then looked at the Senior Ethics Committee. "You've asked me to speak on behalf of those who've been silenced. But the truth is, I was one of them. I was silent for a long time, until someone tried to erase the silence too." Behind him, the screen lit up. First, a clip of his incident. Then, the passenger data overlays. Finally, what no one expected. A new video. A deepfake. A convincingly forged recording showing Kalani allegedly berating a flight attendant months ago. The voice mimicked his cadence. The backdrop was fabricated from composite flight interiors. The metadata was designed to bypass standard detection tools, and yet, it was all fake. "This clip," he said, calmly, "was released 3 days ago by a leaked source. It's now circulating on 3 social platforms. It's being cited in smear campaigns against international aviation reform, and it's not real." He paused, then added with unmistakable fire, "They couldn't destroy the system, so they tried to destroy the man." The room remained still. Then, from the back, an older Senegalese delegate stood and asked gently, "And what do you want us to do?" "Captain Kalani." He didn't blink. "Don't protect me. Protect the passenger who doesn't have a badge, a platform, or a press release. Protect the mother who was humiliated in silence. The child who was forced off the plane because his face was too different. The elder veteran who was denied water in row 3B. The screen behind him shifted again, this time showing anonymized footage from whistleblowers across 11 airlines. Real stories, real passengers, all flagged, punished, or quietly removed for being uncomfortable to the crew. Kalani's voice dropped softer now. "If we let the algorithm lie, the system will follow, and someday, someone else will wake up with a flight confirmation and no dignity left to carry on board." The session went into emergency review that afternoon. 3 motions were proposed. The Kalani Protocol, mandating real-time ethics, auditing of passenger treatment AI systems. Ethics Immunity Clause. Whistleblowers reporting aviation bias to be protected under international law. Deepfake Verification Act. All airlines required to register video footage metadata into secure timestamp ledgers, preventing falsified media from weaponizing silence. Meanwhile, behind closed doors in Brussels, Skylift made its final move. They knew the testimony would go global, so they activated what they called OP Restore Balance. Their plan: flood the digital space with alternate footage showing Kalani contradicting himself, fake interviews, fake tweets, synthetic statements. Hire a group of influencers to question how someone with ties to Iranian forces can dictate global flight rules. And worst of all, leak internal communications suggesting Kalani had secret financial backing from foreign governments. It wasn't about truth anymore. It was about distraction, confusion, and fatigue. But they made one mistake. They forgot what kind of soldier Kalani was. Back in Geneva, Kalani stood in front of the International Civilian Systems Council, not as a victim, not as a soldier, but as a strategist. He'd spent the last week partnering with a coalition of global coders, watchdog orgs, and data activists. They had mapped every node in Skylift's synthetic smear network, and that morning, with global live streams rolling, they did the unthinkable. They released the entire covert campaign map live to the public, including the timestamps, financial trails, and social engineering ops behind the deepfakes. The fallout came in waves. Interpol announced an immediate investigation into AI smear warfare. Skylift's stock fell 17% in 2 hours. Brazil and Indonesia suspended all Skylift operations until further ethics clearance. And within 36 hours, Meta and X pulled over 430 fake Kalani videos from their platforms, many traced to Skylift's affiliate servers. Kalani didn't gloat. Instead, he flew to Tehran, not to speak, to visit someone he'd promised to protect. An old man waited by the hospital window, Colonel Davoud, the former general who once told Kalani, "Your silence will speak louder than their noise." Kalani sat beside him, quietly. Davoud turned, smiled weakly. "They tried to blur your face," Kalani nodded. "They did." Davoud closed his eyes for a moment, then whispered, "So, what did you do?" Kalani looked out the window. "I sharpened everyone else's. That night, a joint statement was issued by 14 international aviation bodies. The Kalani Protocol was officially adopted. Clause 13 was ratified into the UN Ethics Charter, and Skylift was suspended from the Global Aviation Alliance for 24 months, pending systemic reform. No single man had done it, but a single man's silence had carried a weight the world could no longer ignore. As Kalani boarded his next flight, economy seat, window side, no entourage, a young black boy across the aisle looked at him curiously, then whispered to his mom,
Is that the man who got pushed?
His mom smiled. That's the man who stood still. And the world moved around him. 2 weeks after the UN ratified the Kalani Protocol, it seemed like the dust had finally settled. Skylift had been suspended. International carriers scrambled to update their ethics systems. Passengers from Nairobi to New York were finally seeing visible crew accountability metrics on their mobile boarding passes. For the first time, it felt like passenger dignity had a seat at the table. But while the world applauded, Skylift was quietly working on a way back in. The plan didn't involve appeals. It didn't involve public statements. It involved a name no one had heard in years. Eastway Aero, a small, almost forgotten regional airline based in Malta. In a series of late-night transactions routed through 6 shell companies, Skylift acquired Eastway in full, then rebranded it publicly as a fresh new airline committed to ethical travel. The kicker: they used Kalani's language from past speeches in their launch materials. They even quoted his "dignity can't be delayed" phrase in their onboarding campaign. To the public, it looked like a new ally. To Kalani, it smelled like camouflage. He was reviewing the Eastway announcement from a small airport cafe in Helsinki when a familiar ping hit his tablet. Ethos Core Alert. Potential shell acquisition flagged. Entity: Eastway Aero. Linked asset: Skylift Holdings disguised via Omega Gulf Trust. Kalani didn't even finish his coffee. That evening, he called an emergency meeting with the UN Passenger Ethics Committee. They're re-entering the system through the side door, he said, pulling up a flowchart of the Shell transaction trail. They're betting we only watch the front gates. An older ethics officer frowned. They think if they change the logo, we'll forget what's underneath. Kalani nodded. And this time, they're not just hiding. They're weaponizing our own language to make it harder to spot the rot. The committee voted 7-0 to launch a provisional audit of Eastway Aero, but they hit a wall. Because technically, Eastway had no prior violations. They had a new name, a new board, and no flights yet. They were, on paper, clean. That's when Kalani realized, we don't need to prove what they've done. We need to prove how they're planning to fail ethically before it happens. He requested access to Eastway's proposed crew ethics training module, which all airlines were now required to file under the new Kalani Protocol. The file arrived. To the untrained eye, it looked fine, but Kalani spotted a quiet clause buried in the appendix. Behavioral tolerance thresholds will be contextually evaluated based on operational discretion and customer energy levels. Translation: if a passenger seemed too intense, a crew member could justify downgrading their service without triggering an ethics flag. Kalani sat back in his chair. They're coding discrimination into a feeling. He gathered a small coalition of data scientists, civil rights advocates, and flight training experts together. They modeled real-time case simulations using Eastway's framework, showing how a calm black passenger asking for clarification could be flagged as escalating, while a belligerent white traveler might be recorded as energetically engaged. They called it the bias loop, and Kalani presented it to the International Aviation Ethics Tribunal in a 9-minute demo that went viral within 3 hours. Within 24 hours, Eastway's ethics certification was revoked. Their operating license was frozen pending a full investigation. Skylift's attempted re-entry was publicly exposed, and this time, they didn't even try to deny it. They released a 4-sentence statement blaming aggressive overreach by Kalani and called for a free market in aviation ethics. But the public wasn't buying it anymore, because now they'd seen the blueprint and they knew what to look for. That night, Kalani walked the tarmac alone after landing in Zurich. No cameras, no news crews, just the quiet hum of refueling trucks and the scent of cold jet fuel. A ground crewman passed him, then stopped, turned back. "Hey, Captain Kalani." Kalani turned. "Surprised?" "Yeah." The man smiled. held up his badge, used to work Skylift. Transferred out after the Vienna directive. Just wanted to say, thanks. I didn't know we were part of the problem until you made it clear. Kalani gave a quiet nod. No one sees the machine when they're inside it. They called it the Geneva session. 87 countries, 14 global airlines, and one man at the podium, dressed in a plain civilian suit with no medals, no rank. Just a quiet presence that had already reshaped an entire industry. Major Kalani, or as the press had begun calling him, the passenger's commander. He didn't speak right away. He stood in front of the delegates for a full 10 seconds, letting the silence settle like dust over old decisions. Then he leaned into the mic and said, "This isn't about me. It's about the man in 9C who had to smile while being disrespected. The woman in 4A who stopped asking for water because the crew rolled their eyes. And the child in row 17 who was told his headphones were too loud. But no one else's were. The audience didn't move." Kalani clicked the remote, and behind him, the screen changed. It displayed the new Passenger Integrity Index, a real-time system now adopted by 43 countries, tracking how airlines treat their passengers based on demographic, behavioral, and ethical flags. Under it was a single phrase: "It's not service unless it's consistent." He paused, then looked up again. We can no longer allow ethics to be optional. Not when a seat becomes a silent stage for humiliation. Not when silence is used as camouflage. Not when dignity is denied with a polite smile and no record kept. The crowd shifted, not uncomfortably, but with the quiet tension of self-awareness. Heads of state, aviation CEOs, and compliance directors all sat shoulder to shoulder. Because today wasn't about performance, it was about accountability. Then came the vote, the Passenger Integrity Accord, a legally binding global charter that would make passenger ethics scores publicly visible before boarding, require all crew training to be audited by a cross-cultural board, ban the use of emotion-biased algorithms in flight evaluations, and most controversially, allow passengers to flag mistreatment without fear of removal or retaliation. The results appeared on the massive screen behind Kalani. Yes, 81. No, 4. Abstain, 2. It passed by a landslide. Kalani didn't celebrate. He simply closed his folder, nodded once, stepped off the stage. But as he walked down the aisle of the conference hall, people stood, one by one, not clapping, just standing, quietly, like the way he'd stood that day on the plane, not saying a word and changing everything. Later that evening, a young journalist caught up with him just outside the building. She was nervous, recorder already rolling. "Captain Kalani, do you think this accord will really change anything long-term?" He smiled gently. "I don't think laws change people, but laws give people something to point to when they finally decide to stop accepting less." Before he left Geneva, he boarded a small regional flight to Marseille. No entourage, no notice. He sat in 17A, by the window. A flight attendant approached him midway through boarding and hesitated, then said, "Sir, I just wanted to say, I used to think passengers like you were the problem. Turns out, it was the system around us." Kalani looked up at her with kind eyes. The system wasn't built broken. It just got comfortable. She nodded. "Thank you for waking it up." The plane took off into a quiet sky. And for once, nothing felt heavy in the cabin. Not the silence, not the seatbelt, not even the past. If you've ever been treated unfairly while flying, not just ignored, but quietly dismissed, then you know what this story really means. Would you have stayed silent like Kalani, or spoken up? Tell us where you're watching from and how you would have handled that moment. And if you believe it's time dignity took the front seat again, don't just like the video. Share it with someone who's been there. This is Telltales, where silence ends and stories begin.